We have three speakers who, in a way, embody that triad that Russell Hittinger mentioned earlier, the poetic, the scientific, and the practical, if I may. Of course, bringing them together into a conversation, not suggesting a kind of exclusivity there. Our first speaker is an author, a professor of English Emerita from Holy Names University, and DSPT Fellow. Please welcome Velma Richmond.
Some years ago, I made my first initial presentation as a fellow of the DSPC, a consideration of how Catholicism informed my professional career. The first response from the audience was, "That's brilliant, but aren't you extinct?" Sadly, circumstances today make that reaction even more likely. I'm now an octogenarian at a time when technology and political correctness dominate the world, especially academe. Moreover, the meaning of disinterested has been largely lost as a way of thinking and behaving, for all that the computer's thesaurus offers: fair-minded, unbiased, impartial, without prejudice, neutral, objective, able to see all sides. When I listen to the stories of those who are currently professors of literature and language, they tell of antagonism, required exceptions for students so that they need not encounter anything that makes them uncomfortable, and expected bestowing of A grades, since, after all, students employ professors and deserve value for money. The university has often become a place for sharp business transactions. I am acutely aware that I would not survive in this world, and thus deeply saddened. However, I rejoice because God has bestowed on me singular blessing. I am retired. and thus left to pray, study, and write, a form analogous to Dominican preaching. Today affords an opportunity to emerge from my scriptorium to speak directly about English studies. I'm most grateful to be a fellow at this convocation. Since much of my research has been devoted to chivalric romance, I live in a world of high idealism and faith, characterized by unending quest and determination to persevere in spite of obstacles. The post-chivalric knight-errant Don Quixote, my current book subject, tilted at windmills that he perceived to be giants. Alas, today's opponents of English studies, indeed of the humanities and arts, are unfortunately very real giants. Those who study and profess these disciplines have always been challenged to defend their choice, including the unfortunate, if you can't do anything else, you can always teach. Nevertheless, I strive to be a champion, however quixotic. When I joined the faculty of the College of the Holy Names, now Holy Names University, English was the preferred major, a sign that it was the efficacious way a Catholic woman could prepare for a worthy life as person, wife, and mother, and perhaps also a professional career. This, after all, was 1958. Moreover, English studies had a place outside academe. The Catholic Voice, the diocesan newspaper, printed reviews of current novels of interest to Catholics. Today, psychology has replaced English, as it has philosophy, as the preferred major by those who do not choose practical training. Sought objectives are critical thinking, leadership, and cultural competence. No longer mentioned are written and oral skills in expressing oneself in English. Are these essential competencies obsolete in the age of Twitter and texting? Fellows were asked to address the state of knowledge in one's discipline and its significance to the faith and/or its relation to the evangelization of the culture. While I am not casting myself and the discipline that I love as victim, I can only describe English studies as in a parlous state, as are foreign languages and other literatures. Vast changes since the 1960s inevitably determined how the discipline is valued. Its decline. Professors replaced the core canon within a sense of history and a moral tradition with highly specialized topics, typically not with a literary focus. Moreover, they embraced impenetrable academic jargon that even their peers could not follow. I can't tell you how frequently my husband and I peruse literary journals and read aloud obscure passages for satiric effects. Our version of the editor of a journal who wanted to have a large stamp which said, "So what?" Today's approaches are especially ironic since, in fact, English studies were established initially to foster higher education more broadly than did Greek and Latin, favored for centuries, but restricted to an elite from which many, especially women, were excluded. David Lodge, in his satiric novels of academe, describes what happened. Robin, the heroine of Nice Work, was swept into the glittering wave of theory. Structuralism and post-structuralism, semiotics and deconstruction, new mutations and graftings of psychoanalysis and Marxism, linguistics and literary criticism, the latest thought of Roland Barthes and Julia Kristeva. Robin forced her mind through the labyrinthine sentences of Jacques Lacan and Jacques Derrida until her eyes were bloodshot and her head ached. She sat in lecture theaters and nodded agreement as young Turks of the faculty demolished the idea of the author, the idea of the self, the idea of establishing a single univocal meaning for a literary text. The consequences are obvious when Robin lectures about 19th century novels. What Robin likes to do is deconstruct the text, to probe the gaps and the absences in them, to uncover what they are not saying, to expose their ideological bad faith, to cut a cross-section through the twisted strands of their semiotic codes and literary conventions. What the students want her to do is to give them some basic facts that will enable them to read the novels as simple, straightforward reflections of reality, and to write simple, straightforward, exam-passing essays about them. In my day, as a student and as a professor, such cleavage between the interest of scholarship and pedagogy were not typical. I am an old historicist. Courses were major authors, Chaucer, Shakespeare, and Milton, or chronological, Renaissance, early modern in today's parlance, 18th, 19th, 20th century. The happy marriage of literature and history that provides context outside one's own limited moment is, I think, essential, as is a core canon that provides a basis for conversation. Too much of today's analysis, literary or political, begins with a Procrustean bed, a rigid ideological frame into which all must fit, conform. Everything else is denied. Typical courses are feminism, masculinity, materialism, clothes, money, garbage, cultural bias, and queer studies. Texts are read to support issues rather than to try to encounter literary masterpieces and to understand something of the medieval or the Victorian mind, and thus broaden knowledge and qualify one's limited awareness. With apologies to patriotism, and especially to fellows who are Americanist, I urge that Catholics need English studies because the major texts were written before the Protestant Reformation, while history and literature began in the United States with 17th century Puritanism not very hospitable to Catholicism. Medieval literature is Catholic. Indeed, distinctions between religious and secular do not apply. Medieval drama tells the stories of Scripture. The Canterbury Tales are heartily of this world, told by men and women from every estate, but on a religious journey, the pilgrimage of life. Troilus and Cressida, a romance set in pagan Troy, ends when the slain lover hero looks down from the eighth sphere upon this little spot of earth and laughs. Chaucer urges his hearers, readers, to, and I'm going to translate here, look up to the God that made them after his image, and to think this world passes soon as a fair flower, and love him that for love upon a cross to buy our souls first died and rose and sits in heaven above, for he will betray no one that places his heart entirely on him. Shakespeare was long claimed as Protestant, yet this transcendent writer's affinities to Catholicism are now recognized. Even ardent Anglicans admit his Catholic habit of mind. Milton, of course, is aggressively Protestant, but Catholics gain from encountering his passionate Christianity and biblical knowledge, as well as classical. As conclusion, I offer a broad argument, which for literature means telling stories. First, I cite my favorite Oxford anecdote. The principal of the college, interviewing a potential student, asked, "Why do you want to study?" The applicant answered with gushing enthusiasm, "I want to realize myself." To which the principal sagely replied, "Surely, my dear, we can do better than that." Or as St. Thomas More prayed, "Lord, do not permit me to trouble myself with that very cumbersome thing called I." And recall Chesterton's orthodoxy. Complete self-confidence is not merely a sin. Complete self-confidence is a weakness. Believing utterly in oneself is a hysterical and superstitious belief. I know no better way to avoid this failing than to encounter great literature of the past. I join Chesterton in advocating that marginalized group, the dead. Finally, I refer to Nice Work, the aptly named novel. Robin makes the basic defense of English studies when the CEO of a manufacturing plant challenges her job. Wilcox regards English as a soft option, perhaps okay for women or mancy boys, but asks why others aren't studying something practical, engineering, computers. Robin replies, because they're more interested in ideas, in feelings, than in the way machines work. He counters, won't pay the rent though, feelings, ideas. When she asks, is money the only criterion? He persists. However, he looks startled, caught off balance for the first time after she asks, what about happiness? And simply declares, I don't earn much money, but I'm happy in my job, or I would be if I were sure of keeping it.
Thank you, Velma. Next, if you will, the scientific, indeed, a cognitive scientist, educator, and co-founder of Mind My Education, Paul Bulakowski.
Thank you, Father Brian. Thank you, Manuel, for inviting me here to do the impossible task of trying to summarize the sort of state and trends of education in 10 minutes. So I'll just come right out and give my overarching theme because it's only going to be loosely connected to everything else I say. Through teaching and learning, education is an open embrace and a positive attitude towards the unknown, which is that which is beyond our current state, and realizing the historical traditions and allowing for unwitting mistakes of the past to have happened, but always looking forward to progress the understanding towards truth. To this event, I love that there is a truly intergenerational transfer of knowledge going, and I believe, especially here in Berkeley and with the traditions that we've had over the decades, that it is only through that intergenerational transfer of understanding of knowledge that we are going to progress with hope and positivity. So I hope as we move forward that this talk, which I just have some sort of bullet points because as I was sitting in the back listening to everything, my biggest fear came out, which is that I'm going to get accused of plagiarizing what was already said before. There was talk of education throughout this entire conference. So I had to sort of rework what I was going to say. But here's the general overview since I'm unknown to most people here. A little bit of my education, because I understand trends in education through my own education and through my own professional sort of pursuits. I want to give some broader trends that I see happening. Mostly I'm going to be talking about the K-12 system, because that's really where I've been focused for the last about 3.5 years. And then to really give some challenges ahead, because we do really need to think critically now, and we need to embrace multiple viewpoints in order to think critically about our challenges. So here goes. So in grade school, St. Hedwig's, it closed down to the upper grades right after I was in the 7th grade, so I went across town to St. Francis to finish up the 8th grade. My parents gave me a choice to go to the public high school down the road or take the parochial option, which is in the next city over. I chose to stay in the parochial because there were problems, and this is back in the 90s, with the public education system, and I realized that. So after a stellar baseball career in high school, I finally became turned on to academics. In my senior year, where I was offered, the teacher had to write me into an honors psychology course, and then I took one of the first courses in neuroscience that was offered in high school. And this is 1997, and one of the most brilliant things that I think the teacher did was say, I'm going to be a learner along with you all, and if you stay studying in this field, you can be an expert because very little is known. So again, back to the theme of education being an exploration into that which is not known. In the 90s, it was deemed the decade of the brain, and it's 25 years later, and we still have brains. So onward from high school, I found a nice university, Fairfield University, which was close enough to home so I can stay close to family as they were in their years where they were passing away. It was there that I pursued deeply the pursuit of knowledge, stopped playing baseball, and I probably count about 10 mentors from Fairfield University. One of the only things that I struggled with in my first year as I pursued philosophy and neuroscience was some of the scientists telling me that I had to drop my spiritual beliefs in order to become a true scientist. And well, I'm still here struggling with that, and I generally believe that if we turn our focus to the shared common understanding that is provided by history, that is provided by science, that is provided by story and tradition, that we would consider those things that are on the fringes merely something to try to educate each other onto. So on from there, I went to graduate school at University of California at Davis. I studied psychology, specifically perception, cognition, and cognitive neuroscience, mixed with a little bit of developmental neurobiology. I was really interested in the basics of phenomenological awareness as we understand it coming through our senses, our sort of contact with this outside world, as processed through our cognitive systems, thereby sort of creating a sense of self, or I'm not sure, nobody's sure, I don't think, where that all comes from, but it has something to do with your brain, right? So you want to study those mechanisms. So I did. And my dissertation built upon, of course, the shoulders of other people. And what I did is I psychophysically measured that one's perception is not always in line with their action. And that was something that I heard echoed at a talk over here on a sort of reaction to the current state of the political world, that one's beliefs aren't always in line with their action. Well, what I was looking at in graduate school was simply like our perception, our sensory processes, they present somewhat of a lens to us, and we act in response to what we sense differently from what we believe we think. Everyone, or at least everyone I measured. So I did a lot of teaching, always taking seriously the profession of teaching as also the teacher being a learner. And I think that we are seeing this big inversion in education right now, from one teacher to many students, to this idea you may have heard of personalized learning, where every student sort of has their own individual sort of path forward that's facilitated not necessarily just by a sage on the stage, but more of a guide on the side. And so I really tried to take that through as I tried to hone my own teaching skills. So while my focus, vision science, I work with the blind and visually impaired, which is quite a humbling experience to, be asked to get outside of my own dominant modes of taking in information through my eyes and more trying to understand the felt world and how I translate information. And because people up at the university, were asking me, they said, I'm going through neurodegenerative disease right now. I'm not going to have my sense of vision. How is it that I can adapt my life? And so I started to study the sense of touch, haptics, and that even broadened my understanding of our perception of the world. So I went on to take a professorship at the University of the Pacific. My focus was in biopsychology, but my favorite course was the one that nobody else wanted to teach, that we were departmentally required to have one representative teaching, and that was the freshman seminar, What is a Good Society?, where we looked at the broad questions that didn't necessarily have answers from multiple perspectives, maybe starting from the self, but broadening itself out to the family, civil society, the state, and ultimately sort of, the environment, the universe, that sort of nested sphere. And so that was very exciting. And I thought, this is going to be great. I'm going to see young learners come up through this and see how they grow. But that's not what I noticed. In the third year, one of my top students, my first year of teaching, she seemed beaten down. She seemed overwhelmed. She seemed stressed. She seemed like she was just trying to study for the next exam to pass the test, and students were coming just asking, what is on that test? And I said, I didn't write it yet because I'm not sure what we're all interested in. Let's have a conversation. No, I don't have time for that. So, I realized that most people, a lot of people in university now that come up are really, they're getting a lot of remedial work, and I actually felt, I felt like it wasn't quite right to take $40,000 of money. Of course, the professors don't get that, but and essentially teach high school. And I have been teaching motivated high school youths. I've been teaching them about cognitive neuroscience just to give back that first experience that I had with neuroscience. So I left the ivory tower. I retired. After 3 years, and so I did I often say my own master's program in education, and I in order to support myself and to make it a real thing, I started an educational company called Mind My Education. And it is a little bit of a double entendre. It's kind of, put some neuroscience, put some critical thinking, but also kind of mind my education, right? So our mission with Mind My Education is to help cultivate a compassionate society of aware, curious, and empowered learners. At first, we started trying to teach neuroscience to children, but since neuroscience was not required at the grade school level, we quickly realized that we needed to pivot business strategies and to meet people where they were at. Our sort of philosophy comes from a combination of a number of historical and very important traditions of the Greeks and the Socratic method, of our understanding of human modeling and imitation and learning through seeing, to Maria Montessori and Paulo Freire, and this whole new field of educational neuroscience. So Manuel wanted me to show one graphic, and so here it is. This was our problem that we're trying to solve. It's a graph of enthusiasm towards learning as a function of kindergarten through 12th grade. And it starts, this is summarized from thousands of individual students and teachers, and it shows it starting, it shows a graph starting at 95% in kindergarten, plummeting to about less than 50% in the 6th grade. I think that humans are naturally curious. I think we all are curious always. And so really what we had to do was to try to understand what makes learning work. Well, fortunately, there's science out there, and there are the ability to communicate learning science. We have a whole new means of communication now with the internet, and so the ability to share information is just phenomenal. Okay, so let me. So of course we are trying to provide a form of education that honors the individual, that honors the original meaning of the words. Beyond definitions, which I think we should all talk about, what I think is especially challenging is to agree upon the aims of education. What are the goals? What are the aims? And in my study of what people are talking about in the global educational policy realm, there's multiple aims. There's not just one. It's a plurality of aims. And yes, it's a philosophy pursued for its own sake. It's also about human capital and thriving together as a society as our numbers grow. It's about respecting the systems that emerge from our past interactions. And I believe it's to strive to the good in its infinite forms. There are a few points pertinent to this great time of transition that I believe we're in education and living through it. It's a really wonderful time. One is the elephant in the room. It's the internet. It has a lot on there. Although I hear it only weighs as much as a strawberry if you weighed all the electrons. So we have a change in the communication medium, and just like transportation revolutions, it will bring great change. I believe it also brings great hope, and that's something that I hold on to strongly, and a number of the people that I work with also do. There is the arousal addiction that I think a number of people have pointed to even today, that young people are spending 8+ hours on the screen, but I don't think that we shouldn't think that they're not educating themselves. In fact, they have a global audience. They can have a global audience. So I do think that there are changes that are going to come because of the internet, and already have. I think we have to take seriously, and people are starting to take seriously, people like Dr. Daniel Kahneman, Nobel laureate behavioral economics, and accounting for that difference between the perception or the imagination and the rational. Our motivational sciences, author Daniel Pink described motivation in terms of almost like a formula. Motivation or drive equals autonomy and mastery and meaning or purpose. To motivate the young means that they have to have a number of things in place at the same time. There's a huge field of learning science which piggybacks on educational neuroscience and is part of it. We have drastically underestimated the cognitive capacity of our young people. There is a debate over what to measure and how to measure it. And that is a good chance for debate. I think another trend that I've been seeing is the realization that parents and family need to be directly involved with the education of our young people. No way is one teacher to 20 young people, 1 to 30, 1 to 40 even, going to suffice, even with educational technology in the classroom. We need to make sure that we honor the role of all of our teachers, including our parents, our neighbors, and our extended family. I think that recently there has been an embrace of heterodoxy, which is a movement towards embracing multiple viewpoints. All the while agreeing, I think, something that we commonly miss, that we mostly agree on most things. Some of those things: peace, not war; food, not starvation. And I think something that came up in the morning session a couple of times was how to facilitate that intergenerational transfer and looking for some of those sort of basic fundamental truths. I don't have many of those, but I have one to offer for maybe a suggestion to like talk about. And that is that there exists something rather than nothing. I haven't been able to entertain conversations with anybody who didn't take that as something to stand on as a platform. I do think that, I'm talking about some of the trends, and one of the trends is towards heterodoxy, both in the universities, but also, I think just in general, we're realizing that there are more points of view than a simple sort of unidimensional, say, right-left structure. I mean, at least we could bend our cognitive mechanisms into 2 dimensions. Never mind try to, embrace or try to understand what modern mathematics is telling us, that there might be dimensions past the 3 spatial and 1 temporal that we're commonly dealing with. So I think, again, going back to the overarching theme, education seems to be about an embrace of the unknown and a striving towards it, without throwing out the bathwater, the water that we're all in. Of course, everyone's probably heard of some of the movements towards school choice. I'd like to suggest that we should also be talking about instructional choice as being a real option. And so personalized learning is a thing. And I think in order for young people to really feel that power that I think everybody wants to feel, we need to allow them to hold the map to their educational future. And I think we have to make sure to keep our human element and celebrate our past traditions. It's how we got here. Another trend that I hope for, maybe more than I see, is synthesis. Instead of getting down into the silos of our individual sort of pursuits of knowledge, which is a great thing, we need to go locally, but we also often need to come out and to see the sort of more global picture. And I think that even in the science, technology, and engineering and mathematics pushes that we're seeing today, they at least put a little A in there. Has anyone heard of STEM education? Well, at least now they're putting STEAM in there, right? There's an A. So I'm focusing on the A, and that's at least a step in the right direction. And then I think a real trend that's becoming known is that the medium really is the message. And so what is the mediums that we're teaching through? Okay, so those are some of the trends I saw. Some of the challenges is, as was brought up this morning, to build from a common ground between science, art, religion, and all else that I have and have not come to even think about. To understand education in the broadest possible sense, our entire information diet. A refusal to be paralyzed and frozen in the confusion of events. Young babies, when you present them with visual illusions, they tend to look at them for longer. They embrace that which doesn't make sense. Show a baby something that's kind of not being supported, they'll be intrigued. They'll go towards it. I think that there are other natural responses to freeze in the light of confusion, to freeze in the light of things that we don't understand. Yet with the advent of quantum mechanics, something that Einstein himself helped discover but could not quite grapple his mind around, we may have to look towards different logic systems that we can program into computers that can allow for A and not A to both be held at the same time, to be able to talk about Schrodinger's cat. We know that even the basic events of nature, like photosynthesis, do require quantum action. I think one of the biggest challenges, maybe I'd even call it a danger, is nihilism. I embrace being comfortable with not knowing, and to even relax in that state, to have compassion, both self-compassion and compassion for others. I believe the word mercy was mentioned. There are many people who I believe are in the same state. I believe most of us are. I believe one of the big challenges is to tie together our perception, our understanding, our imagination, and our action, and our willingness to act in line with our beliefs. I think we do need to renew our passion for ethics, and I think this is something that only comes with deep and sustained reading and intergenerational transfer of knowledge, especially as we program algorithms that are based on the cognitive mechanisms that we're finding in our mind. I think that ethics is more important than ever. We always want to make sure that our artificial intelligence is serving our intelligence, not trying to destroy it. So I really think that we should be focusing on the overlap. One of my graduate mentors asked me, he said, how much is shared? I said, maybe 95% of stuff is shared. And we often argue, and we're brought into arguments around the fringes. And I think that those arguments are good to have, but I think we should also celebrate those 95%. He said, he says, is there a standard deviation on that number? I said, of course, it's only a guess. I said, plus or minus 7.5%. So, but I do believe that that by focusing on some of those same pieces of shared overlap, like peace, not war, food, not starvation, freedom, not oppression, we can come to a better understanding and help each other through this path as one family. Thank you.
And as we do seek connections, thank you, Paul, we seek connections not only between the poetic and the scientific, but also with the practical. Our next speaker is an entrepreneur, also an author, founder and former CEO of both Team Tools and Winkler Advertising. She is also trustee of Holy Names University and Santa Clara University and a DSPT fellow. Please welcome Agnieszka Winkler.
Well, it's tough to be third after this nice nourishment of the poetic and the scientific, and now we're definitely going into Ignatian mode, the practical side. And since many of you here in the audience are involved with higher education, this is likely to be a little unpleasant and challenging. Given the climate today of so much disinformation, fake news, gross factual errors, the watering down of the intellectual content of almost everything, as a result of what I might politely call the democratization of information, the topic of the stewardship of knowledge is particularly timely. And I'm going to have no answers for you today, but I do have some facts and some predictions of experts on long-term trends that directly affect education, the impact of disruptive change in society that is all around us, and the conclusion that that has a significant impact on the sustainability of the university business model, period. Why this is important, particularly in the context of what we're talking about today, is that the stewardship of knowledge has been in the hands of the church for about the past 2,000 years, and increasingly in association with universities over about the last 800 or so. And our U.S. institutions of higher education are a direct descendant of the medieval university model, and they, of course, rightly treasure their long history and deeply respect the tradition. However, universities are in grave danger. The current business model of universities is simply not sustainable in the context of the environment in which they operate. So let me elaborate a little bit. Let's take a quick look at some predictions. A 2013 University Vanderbilt study found that the average annual number of four-year colleges that have closed or were acquired has very recently doubled. Moody's rating service predicts that the rate of closures will triple in 2017, and the rate of mergers will double, all due to financial pressures resulting from declining enrollment. Google's top-rated futurist, Thomas Fry, predicts that over 50% of U.S. colleges will collapse by 2030. And 2030 is, less than 15 years away. So why is this happening? And can we do anything about it? I offer the following. First, the demographics of college-age kids is declining for the next several years, so we're kind of in a trough now. And more stringent immigration policies could potentially affect this decline permanently. Public sentiment around the necessity of a college education is mixed, mainly due to the impression that the return on investment of a college education is no longer there. Two statistics that were alluded to by previous speakers is that in 2013, the number of college graduates working minimum wage jobs was nearly 71% higher than it was a decade ago, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. At the same time, the U.S. has reached almost $1.3 trillion in student loan debt spread out over 44 million Americans. Now, to put that statistic into kind of a more human perspective, a borrower in the kind of a 20 to 30-year age range makes an average monthly payment of $351 per month for that student loan. That's a major impact on a young family's budget. Very significantly, since the early 80s, costs and tuition have been growing faster than the rate of inflation. So again, to put that a little bit into context, while the cost of food and housing has gone up about 300% since 1978, and healthcare, about which we're just totally crazy in this country, went up by 600%, the indexed price of college tuition and fees advanced by more than 1,122%. So double the increase in cost of healthcare, and we're totally exercised by healthcare, and we don't seem to care about the cost of education. A trend responding to that cost issue and the demand for more flexibility, which is another societal trend in education, is the increase in online educational opportunities. Apple's iTunes University reached 1 billion course loads in less than 6 years. Coursera registered 3.2 million students in its first year, and this trend is going to continue to siphon off students from the traditional universities. Then add into that, the current national debate has been focusing on the role of higher education in job preparation and earning potential, perhaps to the exclusion of all other social benefits of an educated society. In a piece he wrote in 2015, Dan Bennett, who is a senior reporter for the Chronicle of Higher Education, attributed this, interestingly enough, to be the result of a comment by the then new governor of California, Ronald Reagan, who was quoted in 1967 as saying, 1967, so we go that far back, as saying that taxpayers should not be subsidizing intellectual curiosity. So are universities morphing into something other than what they have traditionally been, or is this a kind of a temporary sidetrack? Then we have to look at the impact of disruptive change. Those of us who come from Silicon Valley hear disruptive change all the time, and we're very familiar with it. We've been living with it. And our universities are operating in that environment. We are in an era of unprecedentedly fast change. The pace of change is so unique that it has become the subject of Tom Friedman's new book, Thanks for Being Late. And some of you may remember he wrote The World is Flat, which was also a very interesting comment about globalism, et cetera. He's a New York Times columnist. And this disruptive change is in every single sector of our society. As a result of the growth of online shopping, we have too many shopping malls in the United States to sustain brick and mortar growth. Many of you have been reading the headlines post this Christmas, announcing hundreds of store closures among marquee retail brands. Healthcare is moving from hospital care to outpatient as medical technology continues to improve, and the result is that actually now many regions of the country are overbedded. Banks are reducing their footprints because of the popularity of online banking continues to increase. The sharing economy is transferring many industries with the rise of Airbnb in the hospitality sector, Uber in transportation, and there are many other examples. And higher education is actually not exempt from these trends and also suffers from overcapacity for full board, full-time students in the so-called traditional four-year university. Now, we're still not done. Let's layer on some more news. There are some tsunami changes happening in employment. It is projected that 40% of Fortune 500 companies will be obsoleted by 2025, and they will be replaced by what's called exponential organizations. If you haven't heard that phrase, these are companies that are growing at a rate of 10 times their competitors. A small example, Kodak, a long-standing and well-loved brand, went bankrupt in 2012, while at the very same time, upstart Instagram was acquired by Facebook for $1 billion. By 2025, 50% of the US workforce is going to be displaced by robots. No matter what Mr. Trump says about reversing trade deals to bring jobs back, those jobs will be for robots. The Internet of Everything, as more and more devices are connected to the Internet, may create, by some estimates, up to 100 million new jobs in the US, but they're going to be radically different kinds of jobs from what we know today. And I just want to remind you again that the research organizations such as Singularity University, GE Capital, and more are, again, predicting these changes by 2025, which is now, what, 8 years away, 9 years away. I mean, it's right around the corner. So education for 2025 will require tremendous retooling, especially in light of the focus on preparing its alumni for jobs, for meaningful work, for supportability, however you actually want to phrase it. The combination of all of these trends and the technological forces bearing down lead to a conclusion that the traditional university business model is simply no longer sustainable. And by traditional, I just want to clarify, by that I mean tuition-based, with significant fundraising to create a scholarship-based discount rate for private universities, and now actually increasingly for public universities as well, and couple that with government or private loans for funding, and based on a goal of trying to get students out in 4 to 6 years with a liberal arts focus. Now, the reasons for this unsustainability for the business model, aside from all the changes that we were just talking about, is also the high fixed cost orientation and the regimented delivery system in a flexible, on-demand world is simply too big of a disconnect. And to give you by way of example, in the 1970s, it was generally held that you could get goods and services fast, cheaply, or with high quality, but never all three. By the 1980s, US industries had begun to retool to eliminate the need for the consumer to actually have to make a choice between the three. And the mantra became anytime, anywhere, with quality, and at an affordable price. And now pretty much every industry in the US has seriously addressed their cost structure and their product and delivery systems, creating the ability to be much more flexible in an on-demand world, and at the same time they have improved their quality and they have improved their customer satisfaction. Healthcare and education became the laggards, giving the reason that their offerings are different because they require methods of delivery that are just too personal to be changed. Today, however, we're witnessing healthcare is on a very painful and very messy process of delivery transformation, whereas educational institutions still seem to believe that the model that has served so well for so long will continue to do so. And I offer a recent Gallup poll of university presidents that indicates that while in general they have some concerns about higher education, university presidents continue to be very optimistic about their own institutions and their future, indicating either an appropriate level of cheerleading for their institution or a certain naivete about the current very unfavorable trend lines and the degree of impact that they're actually going to have on the universities. My conclusion and my question is that, number one, if universities fail, either because they go out of business or because they become exclusively sophisticated trade schools for a technocratic society, who becomes the steward of knowledge in a culture that's prolific with information and disinformation? And second, if universities are to participate in the stewardship of knowledge, what do they need to do, and very quickly, to remain viable in that necessary purpose? Thank you.